Our comp our competition tonight is macro and close-up. And the judge tonight, and somebody else who, when I said help, our originally scheduled judge, extended his European vacation. Al said, yes, I'll help. So our assigned subject is macro and close-up and open, and I'll turn it over to our judge, Al Brown.
Can everybody hear us?
Yes.
Thanks, Lenny. I could count on you.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Oh, thank you. Got my glasses again, I tell you, it's fun.
It's on your mind.
Assigned B, macro and close-up. Tail.
Yeah, I like the placement of the tail feathers in the frame. I kind of like the curvature it adds here, going all the way around. So it being asymmetrical, I think adds some interest. I think your exposure is handled fairly well here. 7.
Drinking swan.
Okay, your timing here was pretty good. I appreciate the fact that you caught the water coming out of its mouth and the droplets creating some ripples in the water. So I think that does add some interest. But I think you have a little bit of a exposure problem here. This image seems to be a little bit noisy. I know shooting these birds and keeping your exposure in check is a little difficult. But something to be mindful of. You can always raise your ISO a little bit and hopefully recover some detail of the white plumage in post-process. 6.
Colorful seashell.
Interesting subject you have here. I like its placement in the frame. I appreciate the fact that you have a white border around the photo, so we know where you want it to stop. It looks to be relatively sharp. As it's displayed, maybe you could have pumped up the saturation a little bit, but as presented, I like it. 7.
Siberian iris.
It's a very nice subject you have here. I like its placement in the frame. But I can't help but wonder, while it is sharp in some areas, and that's fine, and there is some fall off in it, a couple of the shadow areas here in these 2 top leaves to the left, for anyone viewing this at home, are a little bit strong. You could probably select those in post and brighten them up just a little bit. Otherwise, maybe having some type of reflector to help balance that out, or a flash on your camera. But I'd like to see this again. 7.
Quiet contemplation.
I kind of like this as an abstract photo. Simply because of the softness that was created here in post to help keep the focus on the center of it. And the saturation is strong, but I wouldn't say it's overdone. I'd like to see this again though. 7.
Chips.
These are really cool to do. I see these posted a lot of different places. And, you know, I like the portrait orientation you chose here. I think it works well with all the components and capacitors on the board. I think, though, I would like to have seen this toned down a little bit, just to give it a little bit more of a more subdued exposure here. And I think that would have helped bring up your saturation as a side effect. 7.
Leaf.
You know, I like your subject here. I like the saturation and the tones you have. You know, there seems to be a nice degree of sharpness here. I like the placement of the leaf coming in a little bit of an angle here. I think that works well for this presentation. 7.
Thistle at Foresight.
You know, I think you did a pretty good job here with your exposure, considering the environment you were working in. You know, I wouldn't say this is out of focus. It seems to be a little bit soft. So maybe you could sharpen this up and post a little bit and have it be a little bit stronger, especially towards the center of the flower. But I like to see it again. 7.
Cube.
Really nice subject you have here. I like the way you presented it in the frame. You kept the spacing around it to a minimum. You know, and I think you chose a nice angle to present this at. These are always cool to kind of tinker around with to see what kind of different angles you can achieve, but having this as a head-on presentation works still. 7.
Dandelion seeds.
You know, these are really cool to photograph. You know, a lot of people say that they're everywhere and they're common. Just because something is very common doesn't mean it can't have interest or impact. So I do like this as it's coming in, the stem coming in on the side. I think this is relatively sharp in the center of it. And I think you did well with your exposure. You know, these are always difficult to kind of do. 7.
Vintage shutter mechanism.
You know, this is very cool. And I like the array of the gears that you chose here. Your saturation and exposure work well. I'm going to give this a 7 because I want to see it again. I just can't help but think what this looked like to the right with the gear that's kind of cut in half. You know, I know you always have to kind of pick your poison where you're going to prop these at, but I think just to see this one here on the right-hand side in full, I think that would have been cool to see too. 7.
Curveball.
You know, it's an interesting subject you chose here. I like the fact that it fills the frame a great deal. And, you know, having this on a little bit of an angle so your threads are coming in and out work well. I think your exposure, though, in the center is a little bit bright. I certainly wouldn't say it's blown out because you can still see detail in the leather of the ball itself. I think toning this down a little bit, just to kind of give it a little bit of an even exposure would have helped a little bit more. 7.
Portrait.
You know, I like the placement of the bird in the frame. You know, certainly I like the fact that it's looking at you or off to the side a little bit. There's a little catch light in the eye that always adds some interest, so it's not just completely a black eye. It seems to be a little bit noisy in parts as it's being projected. I wouldn't say it's very distractive, but the level of noise certainly doesn't help the image, but I'd like to see this again. 7.
Crystal bird.
You know, it's a unique subject you have here. I like its placement in the frame. You know, certainly the reflections and the colors from the glass itself all work for you. I think if you were going to do something to kind of to excuse me, you're gonna do something to help this a little bit, maybe just bump up the exposure just a tad, or just hit the shadows, just to kind of bring this up a little bit and give it a little bit more punch. 7.
Dogwood pear.
You know, I like the placement of the flowers in the frame. You know, I think having this in a horizontal or landscape presentation kind of works. And I think the fact that they're backlit certainly adds some impact. I think you probably could have knocked this down by a third in your exposure. There is some detail in the petals, which means nothing is blown out, but I think dropping it down a little bit with your exposure in the field or in post would have made this a little bit more impactful. 7.
A splash of spring.
You know, the tulip certainly stands out in the middle of this photo. I can see that's where you wanted your focus to be. And, you know, I think having this in a portrait orientation kind of helps this along. You know, I think this is more of an abstract than I do an actual macro or close-up because of the processing involved. It's a nice image, but I think it's kind of borderline, like one of the other previous images we saw, but I'd like to see this again. 7.
All right.
Nine. Excuse me, 8. 7. Just because this is a little bit more unique, I'm going to give it an 8. 7. 9. 8. 9. 8. 9. 7. 8. 8. 7. 7.
Okay. Sign B, macro and close-up. Honorable mention. Colorful seashell, Al Figuccio. Quiet contemplation, Fernando Gomes. Thistle at Foresight, Francine Silver. Dandelion scenes, Edward Schulman. Portrait, Wayne Quinto. Crystal Bird, Al Figuccio. Equal merit, tail, Wayne Quinto. Leaf, Wayne Quinto. Cube, Al Figuccio. Vintage shutter mechanism, Fernando Gomes. All right. 13 on this one. Assigned A, macro and close-up. Red tulips.
You know, it's a nice array of flowers you chose here. You know, I think it's very interesting how they're set up in the photo. I think your exposure was handled well, and your saturation was fairly good. And I think you're pretty sharp, at least in the foremost flower, which I think it really kind of has to be. 7.
Tiny purple flowers.
You know, I like the placement of the flowers in the frame. I think you did well with your saturation and exposure. I appreciate the fact that you kept this to a minimum in terms of your spacing and framing around the flowers, 7.
The center of the blues.
You know, really nice subject you have here, very dynamic with your coloring. You certainly handled your exposure well. You know, having the center of the flower off to a third does add some interest. And I think it's fairly sharp at different points where it needs to be, 7.
Spider.
You know, it's an interesting subject you have here. I like its placement in the frame. Certainly having this in a portrait orientation works well with all of its legs. I think the problem I see here with this is this doesn't quite seem to be sharp at any one point, or at least as sharp as it needs to be for a macro or close-up presentation for this particular subject. But I do give you some points for finding this and taking advantage of it, though, 6.
Leaf in the lake.
You know, a very nice image here. It almost has a still life quality to it. I think the landscape orientation works well with the shape of the leaf. And I think putting the vignette in adds a little to this because it helps keep your focus in on the center of the leaf, which by itself doesn't have a lot of color or a lot of pop, 7.
Gerbia daisy.
Interesting part of the daisy you chose to present here. You know, I think this looks relatively sharp, especially where it needs to be. I think you did well with your saturation and exposure, so all those things work here, 7.
The melding of purple and red water drops.
These are very cool. I never have any success with them on my own, so I'm kind of jealous. But you know, I do like the placement of the drop formation in the frame and how it's kind of straddling the magenta and the red. So I think that all adds interest here. And your timing was really, really good too, 7.
Tulip.
You know, I like the fact this has kind of a little bit of a high key feel to it with the white background. Certainly having the flower come in on an angle and a horizontal, I think adds some interest. And, you know, I think you did fairly well with keeping enough of this sharp and making it in a way that someone can look at it and say, okay, I get it, 7.
New leaf.
This is very cool. You know, unlike the other leaf, this one obviously pops off the black background because of its color. You know, I appreciate the fact that it's kind of upside down. If you go by the base of the stem, I think that adds some interest here, 7.
Parrot tulip.
Certainly a different flower to present here. I think that by itself adds some interest. I think, though, your lighting is a little flat. I think you could have used some lighting from the front and not just the side lighting you have coming here on the right-hand side. Even a little fill flash at maybe a quarter or an eighth of your power on your flash would have really popped this up a little bit because there is some nice coloring in through the petals of this flower. But I think I want to see this again, 7.
The eye of a gecko.
Very cool. You know, certainly a unique subject. I like the fact that the eye is off to a third and it's not in the center. And that allows for the right-hand side where you see all the detail and the different coloring in the scales. Nicely done, 7.
Mum.
You know, interesting subject you have here. You know, it has a little bit of of a softness to it. But it's still relatively sharp in the center. So I think that kind of works. I'm just wondering though, what was going on here in post. It looks to be a little odd on some of these leaves around the edges, especially around the top for everyone looking at home. But I'd like to see this again. 7.
Tangled up in you, northern white water snakes.
Very cool. You know, I like the juxtaposition of the snakes' heads and their bodies. I think that all adds interest. You know, and certainly having a difference in the scales adds some interest too, because both of the snakes, with the exception of the head, their bodies are relatively the same tone and exposure. 7.
Okay.
Eight. 8. 9. 8. 9. 9. 8. 8. 7. 9. 7. 9.
Macro and close-up assigned A, honorable mention. Red tulips, Jim Chelan. Tiny poker flower, Charlene Federowitz. Leaf in the lake, Jim Chelan. Tulip, Wendy Kaplitz. New leaf, Jim Chelan. Equal merit, center of the blues, Wendy Milligan. Deborah Daisy, Charlene Federowitz. The melding of purple and red, Wendy Milligan. The eye of the gecko, Wendy Milligan. And tangled up in you, Wendy Milligan. Salon. Macro and close-up, salon. Parrot, tulip, and high key.
You know, I like the placement of the flower in the frame. You know, I like the stem coming up off to the side, kind of leading you up into the bulb. I think you did well with keeping some detail here. Not always easy to do in a high key presentation. 7.
Dragonfly.
You know, interesting subject you have here. I know these are kind of tricky to do. I do like its placement in the frame. Again, just a thing, I think a little fill flash would have helped bring up the interior part of the body to add a little bit more interest, and maybe tap this bright spot down on the, I'm assuming is right eye, would have helped us a little bit. 7.
Love bugs.
Get a room. You know, interesting timing you caught here. You know, I like the juxtaposition of both of the bugs. Certainly adds some interest. And their placement on the bulb is cool. I think that's where the timing runs in. I appreciate you kept the framing here relatively tight. I think maybe just bumping this up with a little sharpness would have helped this a little bit more, but as presented, I like it. 7.
Cherry plum.
Interesting array and how it's placed in the frame. I think that all works for you here. You know, none of these flowers is fighting the other ones. I think your exposure was handled fairly well. You know, I don't know that this was done with the macro lens per se, but you still do see some detail in the petals. So I think you did okay there. 7.
Purple finch profile.
Very nice capture you have here, a nice tight frame, a lot of nice detail in the head feathers. And there's a little fall off in the body, that's okay. But the eye is sharp, the beak is sharp, and there's some nice detail throughout. And there's enough of a catch light or exposure in the eye, so it's not completely black. 7.
Bleeding Heart.
You know, these are always fun to shoot. You know, and I think the fact that you chose an individual one instead of a pair or 3 of them, which you commonly see, works fine here. You know, I like the stem coming in on an angle here and then coming down into the flower itself. 7.
Gerber or Daisy.
You know, very nice. You know, I like the flower being offset to the left in the third. And, you know, nice detail in throughout. Not always the easiest thing to do with oranges and yellows in terms of how it relates to your exposure. 7.
Tulip, Nature's Chalice.
Interesting crop here. I like the part of the flower you chose to show us. It certainly takes up a lot of the frame. I think its sharpness is right there. And I think you did well with your exposure and your saturation also. 7.
The Money Shot.
Great title, very interesting. Not something you would commonly see, at least I don't. You know, and I like the placement of the key in the frame also. And everything in the background is fairly well muted too, so nothing is competing with your subject. 7.
Okay.
Eight. 8. 7. 8. 9. 9. 9. 9. 9 also.
Sign Salon, Macro and Close-Up, Honorable Mention. Parrot Tulip and High Key, Ellen Stein. Dragonfly, Lenny McDonald. Cherry Plum, Ellen Stein. Equal Merit. Purple Finch Profile, Lenny McDonald. Bleeding Heart, Arlene Sopenzetti. Gerber Daisy, Ellen Stein. Tulip Nature's Chalice, Lenny McDonald. The Money Shot, Arlene Sopenzetti. Okay, now the opens. 15. Open B. New York Air Show Flyby.
You know, very nice image. I like the horizontal cropping here. You kept this to a minimum. You know, not the easiest thing to do to track these planes, and also use a slow shutter speed to give the propeller some blur. Which, if you're into aviation photography, is kind of like the holy grail. 7.
Under the Pier at Sunset.
Really nice here. You did well with your exposure. Not the easiest thing to do because you do see some detail in the planks on the underside of the pier. At the same time, though, you were able to manage enough of the pink and orange in the horizon here. 7.
The Man in the Bark.
You know, it's an interesting subject you have here. I certainly appreciate the fact that you got up close with this. And you know, something, it's a little bit different, so I think I'd like to see it again, 7.
Hudson River Dawn.
You know, nice image you have here, certainly, having the clouds, in the sky add a lot of interest, as well as the reflection of them in the water. You know, and that nice little band of orange going into pink as it goes across, the photo, adds some image. And also in the bottom corner, you know, where you see the trees coming up the side of the, there's enough detail here, so you did a decent job with your exposure all around. 7.
Elk Crossing.
You know, I'm looking at this, and it's a nice image. You know, certainly your timing was really, really good. I'm just wondering, though, if you hadn't kept your focus on just the bull and just the male, if this wouldn't have been a much stronger image. I'd like to take a look at it again, so I'm gonna give it a 7, but I can't help but feel that this is the strongest element of your image. Having her in here doesn't hurt it, but it doesn't add anything to the image either. 7.
Shaking Off the Water.
You know, unless you're looking through your camera, a lot of people won't actually see birds doing that with their with your naked eye. And it's cool that you captured this moment with this bird in that position. 7.
Kestrel in Vermont.
You know, I like the fact that you filled the frame with this bird. I think you handled your exposure fairly well. There's a little bit of a catch light in the eye. I think unfortunately where your image suffers a little bit here, doesn't seem to be a lot of detail or sharpness, at least in the head of the bird where it really needs to be. If it tails off around the neck and in the breast area or the rest of the plumage, that's kind of like okay for this type of shot. But you really need that eye and that head sharper than what's been presented here. 6.
Squirrels in Hemlock Falls.
You always tell people that, you know, waterfalls and slow exposure for water is really cool, and how you present it is a personal thing. I know some people like slower shutters than others. I'm always the belief it's just how the image is presented. What you choose for a shutter is entirely up to you. So I think your shutter speed here was sufficient to give you a sense of motion in the waterfall and in the water in the pond below. But it seems to be a little bit of a noisy presentation, at least it's projecting here in the room. And it's a little bit of a distraction for me also. And there seems to be a little something going on in your water. For those of you at home, you look in the base of the waterfall, there's a really odd coloring here. I don't know if you tried to tamp this down in post with your exposure and didn't quite nail it or not, but that's just the way it looks like to me. 6.
Winter Boatyard.
You know, in terms of setting a mood, because everything seems to be fairly well muted, I think this kind of works. But for me, unfortunately, there's no real punch here. And by that, I respectfully mean that there's nothing that really grabs my eye that has any kind of impact, whether it's, you know, very strong or very subtle. But I do appreciate what you were trying to accomplish here. 6.
Pollinating.
You know, you have really nice timing here, you know, with the bees positioned in the flower. And, you know, I know with the macro close-up flowers, having the flower off to the side in the third kind of works. I don't know that it works here because to me, it seems like you want our focus to be on the flower and on the insect itself. And if that's the case, I think here it needs to be centered. So in that case, it would be okay to actually clip off the petals to the right, just as you did here on the left, and kind of turn this into a vertical presentation. I think would have made this a little bit stronger. 6.
Tremendous versicolor.
Well done.
Thank you.
Really nice array of fungi you have here. Certainly the coloring stands out. I think you did well with your exposure. I also appreciate the fact that you filled the frame with them too. 7.
River swimming.
You know, this is kind of a travelogue type of photo. You know, something you might see in an ad or a magazine. And those types of photos are fine. But I think in terms of having, again, some type of impact to make you feel something, aside from giving you a sense of environment, I don't have that here. You know, to get into the fine details of this real quick, to me, the 3 closest people in this photo are looking away from you. And 2 of the people who do kind of catch your eye or should catch your eye are so far away and they're in shadow. But the rest of the foreground, the front third of this, seems to be a lot brighter than the rear third. And it's difficult for me to find something I would really call impactful or something that keeps my eye on it. 6.
Aspire.
You know, interesting placement in the frame. And unlike the other flower we saw in the macro close-up, I kind of feel like I needed to see more of the center of this flower and have it be sharp. I can't really kind of see that here from the angle that you shot this at. You know, I don't mind the blurring, the post process, because that was done with the other one. This just is not visible enough and it's not sharp enough to really have that as an anchor point. 6.
Pilings.
You know, I like how you presented this in a horizontal or landscape orientation. And I think your post-processing is kind of cool. It kind of has like an infrared kind of thing going on. Here, though, I don't know that you need all this area here to the right-hand side with the water. I already have a feel for the water because of the cool reflection you have of the posts or pilings themselves in the bottom part of the picture. So you probably could have gotten rid of, I'm guessing that's 25 to 30% of this photo on the left-hand or right-hand side, excuse me, and just have this be the focus of your photo right in here. 6.
Hooded merganser takeoff.
You know, these are very skittish birds, and you know, the fact that you were able to catch these taking off, you know, your shutter speed was pretty good because the water's frozen and it needs to be high for these birds. But I think unfortunately, because of where they're flying into the sun, but you're shooting them from the side. I don't know that there's enough side lighting in these birds, especially the female taking off, that adds any interest. And you could probably have cropped this a little bit tighter on the back end, almost maybe a half of that, gotten rid of it, would have helped this be a little bit stronger image. 6. Nine. 9. 8. 8. 7. You know, the lighting is not dead on here, but I do like the bird. I think it adds some interest. 8, 9.
Open B. Honorable mention, Man in the Bark, Fernando Gomes. Hudson River Dawn, Wayne Quinto. Shaking Off the Water, Al Faguccio. Equal Merit, New York Air Show Flyby, Al Faguccio. Under the Pier at Sunset, Francine Silver. Tremetis Versicolor, Al Faguccio. Hope I don't have to say that word again. Okay. Open A. Daffodils 2.
You know, I'm staring at this, and I'm taking a little time. You know, these are really cool flowers to shoot just because of the color and the vibrance that they have. But as I'm looking at this, you know, it seems like your array here to the top left-hand side seems to be your focus point here, because the ones down in the bottom seem to be out of focus. And even though they may be in the same plane, because they are not in the same focus in terms of being sharp as the cluster up top, I think they're a little distracting here. So you probably could have cut this off in that top left-hand quadrant and just had that be your picture. 6.
Halo.
You know, interesting composition you have here. You know, certainly the big draw here, you know, are the lights up top. Your exposure, and your saturation was handled fairly well throughout. I'd like to see this again just because it's interesting. 7.
Spring Weather.
Okay, you know, this is a nice presentation just because of the cloud formation. I think we can all see that as an interesting formation you have here, and your exposure was really good. Sometimes those can get away from you. But I think you probably could have cropped off the bottom a good deal, because I don't know if that foreground adds that much interest. You probably could have just cropped this below the tree, the base of the tree, for everyone at home, and just have that go from that point up. I think this would have been a much stronger image. From a timing standpoint, I give you some applause for that. 6.
Sitting on the Tracks.
You know, in terms of catching the animal on the track, I think, you know, that's excellent. You know, obviously having the horseshoe effect of the tracks coming into the frame and then heading back out adds some interest here. I think, though, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more back here on the left-hand side so I could see the complete edge of that rail. Even if there was something there a little bit distracting, because if you did that and it pushed your animal off center a little bit, I think that would have been fine for how this is presented, but I'd like to see it again. 7.
Tulips.
Nice presentation here. You know, I like the vignette of the flowers. And you know, the white border does help here. And you know, there are 3 or 4 bulbs here that are relatively sharp. So it kind of keeps my eye anchored in front. The ones up top in the back, just because of their saturation, are a little distracting. But because how you shot this, it would be difficult to crop out the ones at the top and leave the ones off to the left in this photo. But I'd like to see this again. 7.
Wave.
Nice abstract feel this has. Certainly all the shapes and curves have a lot of interest to them. And the tone of your subject works well too. 7.
Red-bellied woodpecker.
Your timing here was good. So was your shutter speed. I think you probably could have cropped this just a little bit tighter, just to really send home the focus here. Even though this is not what I would call close, I can still see there's some nice detail and sharpness in the head and the beak. And there is a little catch light in the eye too. 7.
The curious little boy.
Interesting subject you have here, and I like this panoramic presentation you have. Going in reverse, coming from the back road up into your subject, really works well here. And the fact that you caught him looking at the back of the buggy adds some interest here too, obviously. 7.
Daffodils 1.
Again, I'm going to have a similar comment as I did before. I hate to be a broken record and repeat myself. The flowers coming up around the top back end are not necessarily distracting because of the saturation or exposure. But I do think they don't add anything because your flowers in the front here are relatively sharp and handled fairly well. I'd like to see this one again though. 7.
The ramp.
It's an interesting composition you have here. Obviously, the two halves of the photos play against one another. I will say this, though. I think I would have liked to have seen the triangle and the half on the right-hand side of the frame. I'd like to see the exposure toned down just a little bit, just because there's not a lot of detail or shape there like there is on the left-hand side. So I think that kind of takes away from that a little bit. 6.
Palm warbler.
Nice placement in the frame. I like the fact that this is coming up on a little bit of an angle of the branch. And I like the bird's placement here. 7.
It's a girl.
I like the placement of the animals in the frame, and I think, in terms of creating a mood or giving you some feeling, I think that works. And while I would like to see this again, I actually think you could have cropped this a little bit tighter. I don't need to see so much of the background with the fence and the tree. And I'm assuming that's a barn or some other kind of structure. I already have a feel that this is a farm type of environment with just this here. So if you had prop this in a square, I think this would have added a little bit more impact, but I'd like to see it again. 7. Eight. 7. 7. 8. 8. 9. 7. 8. 7.
Open A. Honorable mention. Halo, Wendy Kaplitz. Wave, Wendy Kaplitz. Red-bellied woodpecker, Charlene Fedorowitz. Palm warbler, Charlene Fedorowitz. Equal merit, curious little boy, Wendy Milligan. All right. And finally, open salon. Attitude, open salon A.
Very nice. You know, I like the placement of the bird's head in the frame. Nice sharpness throughout. Your exposure and saturation were all handled very well here. And you know, I think it's kind of cool that the eye is kind of half open here. 7.
The Rapture.
You know, I like this. I like the use of the light here on your subject's face and on her neck. And certainly, you know, on the lower part of the face, gives it some nice illumination and separates it from the back part of the photo here. 7.
Osprey with nesting material.
You know, I like the placement of the animal in the frame. I think your shutter speed was fairly good. And, you know, considering the time of day you took this, I think you handled your exposure well. I think this could have used a little bump in saturation, though. It looks a little flat here. 7.
Carolina Wren.
Very cool portrait, really interesting subject. I like the colors of the plumage. You know, I think the head, the eye and the beak are all very sharp, and there's some nice sharpness throughout also. 7.
Eclipse Mania.
You know, these are always kind of cool to see. It's not the easiest thing to accomplish. You know, there's a lot of technical stuff that goes on behind creating these. 7.
Little blue heron nesting.
You know, interesting subject you have here. You know, I like its placement in the frame. I like the fact that it's looking up. And, you know, considering the time of day you took this, I think it's okay with your exposure. You probably could have selected this bird and toned it down a little bit because you've lost a little bit of detail. And just because this is the salon group, lost a little detail up here in the upper beak, and that's just from the sun shining directly down on it. Also, it looks off here to the left-hand side, about middle of the neck. Seems to be a little artifact that something was cloned out. Those are the types of things we have to be a little bit mindful of. But I'd like to see this again. 7.
Tulip tree flower petal.
Interesting subject and presentation, has a very nice mood feel to it. You know, there's nothing really that kind of stands out and hits you like a cold, wet towel. But it does have impact and feeling for me. 7.
Alvin.
You know, I like the placement of the animal in the frame. You know, the fact that it's up on its hind legs and looking off to the outside of the photo, I think adds some interest. Certainly nice to have a little catch light here. The background sufficiently muted. 7.
Osprey in flight.
You know, I like the placement of the bird in the frame. You know, I think the wing position is very pleasing also. I think this is just a tad bit bright. I think you could have toned this down without creating excess shadow in the other side, underside of the wing. 7. Nine. I like this just because it's different. 9. 8. 9. 9. 8. 9, 8, 8,
Open Salon, honorable mention, Osprey with nesting material, Ellen Stein. Little Blue Heron Nesting, Ellen Stein. Alvin, Arlene Sopenzetti. Osprey in Flight, Ellen Stein. Equal Merit, Attitude, Lenny McDonald. The Rapture, Arlene Sopenzetti. Carolina Wren, Lenny McDonald. Eclipse Mania, Arlene Sopenzetti. Tulip Tree Flower Petal, Lenny McDonald. And that concludes our contest.
Does anybody have any questions for Al? Anybody online have any questions for Al?
No questions from me. It's a great
None
meeting.
from me. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
If not, then I will say good night to everybody and congratulations to all the winners.
Good night.